He pulled a dying boy from the snow and discovered the child was shielding something even more fragile beneath his coat, a newborn baby, both orphaned, both hunted, and the only man standing between them and a killer was a widower who had spent 5 years trying to forget how to love, because sometimes the family that saves you is the one you never went looking for. This is where the frontier comes alive. Stories of rugged cowboys and unbreakable women. If this story moved you, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The Wyoming wind didn't just blow. It hunted. It swept down from the Bighorn Mountains like a pack of starving wolves, howling through the canyons and driving ice into anything foolish enough to be caught out in the open. Wyatt Sterling was one of the foolish ones. He pulled the collar of his fleece-lined duster higher, the leather stiff and cracking in the sub-zero temperature. Beneath him, his massive roan gelding, Samson, plodded through knee-deep drifts, tossing his massive head as the snow blinded them both. They had been tracking 3 stray heifers for 2 hours. Wyatt should have turned back. Any sane man would have. But since the fever took his wife and unborn child 5 years ago, Wyatt had found that he preferred the biting cold. It matched the hollow, frozen ache in his chest. It made sense to him in a way the warmth of a hearth no longer did. Through the whiteout conditions, Samson suddenly stopped. The horse let out a nervous whinny, his ears pinning back flat against his skull. "Easy, boy." "What is it?" Wyatt rasped, his voice raw from the wind. He squinted through the swirling curtain of white. At the base of a dead cottonwood tree, maybe 20 yards off the trail, was a mound of snow. It wasn't the shape of a calf. It was too small, too irregular. Wyatt's hand instinctively drifted to the grip of the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard. But as the wind shifted, the snow blew clear for a fraction of a second. Wyatt's heart slammed against his ribs. It was a boot, a child's boot, the sole worn thin and patched with twine. Wyatt swung down from the saddle before Samson had completely steadied. The snow was hip-deep in the draw, but Wyatt tore through it, his long legs fighting the heavy drifts. He dropped to his knees beside the mound and began frantically swiping away the layers of ice and powder. A boy. He couldn't have been older than 8. He was curled into a tight, desperate ball, his knees tucked beneath his chin. His lips were the color of bruised plums, his skin a translucent, terrifying white. Frost clung to his dark eyelashes, and his breathing was so shallow Wyatt couldn't even see his chest rise. Hey, kid, stay with me," Wyatt grunted, pulling off his heavy leather gloves. He pressed his bare fingers to the boy's icy neck. The pulse was there, but it was beating with the sluggish, erratic rhythm of a clock winding down to its final tick. Wyatt reached out to uncross the boy's arms, intending to rub some friction into the child's freezing limbs. But the moment Wyatt touched him, the boy flinched. Even in the depths of hypothermia, a fierce primal instinct flared in the kid. He tightened his scrawny arms across his chest in a vice-like grip, refusing to let go of his oversized, torn wool coat. "Let go, son." "I need to get you warm," Wyatt urged, trying to gently pry the boy's arms away. The boy fought him with the last ounce of his fading strength, a weak, desperate whimper escaping his blue lips. But it wasn't the boy's whimper that made Wyatt freeze. It was the sound coming from inside the boy's coat. Faint, reedy, impossible. It was the cry of a newborn. Wyatt's breath hitched in his throat. He carefully pulled back the frayed lapel of the boy's coat. Tucked securely against the boy's bare chest, swaddled in what looked like a woman's torn petticoat, was a baby. The boy had stripped off his own inner layers, using his own failing body heat as a human shield against the brutal Wyoming winter to keep his sister alive. The infant's face was pale, but when Wyatt touched her cheek, it was miraculously warm. The boy was freezing to death so she wouldn't have to. Wyatt felt a sudden violent sting behind his eyes, a sensation he hadn't felt in 5 years. He swallowed it down, letting adrenaline take over. He quickly unbuttoned his own heavy duster, preparing to wrap them both inside it. As the cold air hit the baby, she let out a sharper cry. The sound seemed to pull the boy back from the brink of the abyss. His frost-caked eyelashes fluttered. Unfocused, glassy eyes stared up at Wyatt's rugged face. The boy's cracked, bleeding lips parted. He grabbed the fabric of Wyatt's shirt with a trembling, frost-bitten fist. "Don't!" the boy rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves crushing under boots. "Don't let him take her. Nobody's taking her, son. I've got you," Wyatt said, his voice thick. The boy's grip tightened with a terrifying, final desperation. He's looking for the ledger." Before Wyatt could ask what he meant, the boy's eyes rolled back. His hand went slack, and he slumped motionlessly into the snow. "Damn it!" Wyatt cursed to the wind. He stripped off his duster, the freezing air instantly biting through his flannel shirt. He wrapped the heavy fleece-lined leather tightly around the boy and the baby, scooping them both into his arms. They weighed almost nothing. It made Wyatt sick to his stomach. He waded back to Samson, hoisting the bundled children into the saddle. He swung up behind them, sheltering them against his chest, becoming a human windbreak. He needed to ride for the cabin, but a hard, nagging instinct in his gut made him pause. Children this small didn't just wander onto the open plains. Wyatt squinted through the storm, following the faint, dragging trail of the boy's footprints before the wind could erase them entirely. They led up a shallow ridge to the west. "Hold on, kids," Wyatt muttered, urging Samson up the incline. 50 yards over the ridge, the harsh reality of the frontier revealed itself. An overturned pioneer wagon lay smashed against a rocky outcrop. The canvas was shredded, flapping wildly in the gale. One of the draft horses was dead in its traces. The other was gone. Wyatt halted Samson. He didn't want to leave the children, but he had to know if the parents were inside, bleeding out or freezing. "Stay!" he commanded the horse, slipping down and drawing his Colt .45, his senses hyper-alert. He approached the wreckage. The smell of copper and death hung in the freezing air, cutting through the scent of pine and snow. Wyatt peered around the splintered wagon wheel. A man and a woman lay in the snow. They hadn't frozen to death. The woman was slumped over a scattered pile of blankets, her lifeblood staining the white powder in a horrific, blooming crimson pool. The man lay a few feet away, his hand outstretched toward his wife. Dead center in his chest was a massive, dark bullet hole. Wyatt lowered his gun, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. This was no accident. This was an execution. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the wreckage. The family's belongings were violently ransacked. Flour and sugar were spilled across the mud, clothes torn from trunks. And there, lying near the dead father's outstretched hand, was a heavy iron strongbox. The lock had been blasted off. It was empty. "He's looking for the ledger." The boy's delirious words echoed in Wyatt's mind. Wyatt knelt beside the shattered strongbox. The wind had been blocked here by the bulk of the overturned wagon, preserving the ground beneath it. Pressed deep into the freezing mud and snow was a single, unmistakable hoofprint. Wyatt traced the edge of the print with his thumb. The right side of the iron shoe was chipped, forming a jagged, distinct V shape. The blood in Wyatt's veins turned colder than the Wyoming blizzard. He knew that hoofprint. Every rancher in the territory knew it. It belonged to the massive black stallion ridden by Silas Thorne. Silas Thorne wasn't just a cattle rustler, he was a ghost, a ruthless land grabber who left nothing but ash and widows in his wake. And Silas Thorne didn't leave loose ends. Wyatt looked back up the ridge toward his horse, where the unmoving bundle of the boy and the newborn baby rested against the saddle horn. Thorne had killed the parents, but he hadn't found what he was looking for. And when the snow cleared, Thorne would realize the children were missing. He would come hunting. Wyatt stood up, the icy wind whipping his dark hair across his eyes. The numbness that had dictated his life for the past 5 years shattered, replaced by a sudden violent inferno of protective rage. He ran back to Samson and swung into the saddle, pulling the shivering bundle tight against his pounding heart. He spurred the massive roan gelding forward. "Hang on, kid," Wyatt growled to the unconscious boy. "We're going home." He rode like hell for the Sterling ranch, knowing full well that his quiet, isolated life had just ended, and a war had just begun. The Sterling ranch cabin appeared through the blinding whiteout like a solitary beacon of timber and stone. Wyatt didn't bother hitching Samson to the post. He kicked the front door open with his heavy leather boot, carrying the bundled children inside, and slammed the heavy oak door shut against the howling Wyoming wind. Inside, the cabin was as cold as a tomb. It had been 5 years since a fire had burned in this hearth for anything other than basic survival. Wyatt laid the frozen bundle onto the large braided rug in the center of the room. He moved with a frantic, desperate energy, striking a match with a trembling hand and tossing it into the dry kindling prepped in the stone fireplace. Flames licked upward, casting a flickering golden glow across the stark, empty room. He dropped to his knees, his frozen fingers fumbling with the stiff leather of his duster to unwrap the children. Leo was unconscious, shivering violently. That was a good sign. It meant his body was still fighting. But when Wyatt pulled back the wool to check on the newborn, his breath caught in his throat. Baby Lily was terrifyingly still. Her tiny lips had turned a pale, dusty blue, and her chest barely moved. She wasn't crying anymore. The brutal cold had finally seeped past her brother's protective embrace. "No, no, no. Come on, little one," Wyatt murmured, his deep voice cracking. He stripped off his heavy gloves and rubbed his calloused hands together over the fire until they were warm, then gently cupped the infant's chest. His hands were too big, too rough. He felt like a bear trying to handle a fragile sparrow. He remembered this suffocating helplessness. He remembered standing in this exact room 5 years ago, watching the life fade from the two people he loved most, entirely powerless to stop it. Panic, dark and suffocating, clawed at his throat. He couldn't do this. He was a rancher, a man who broke wild mustangs and drove cattle through mud and blood. He didn't know how to pull a newborn back from the edge of death. He needed Clara. Wyatt grabbed every wool blanket off his lonely, dust-covered bed and piled them over the boy and the baby, pulling them as close to the radiating heat of the hearth as he dared. "Hold on," he ordered the unconscious boy. "I'm coming right back. I swear to God, I'm coming back." Wyatt sprinted back out into the blizzard, hauling himself into Samson's saddle. He spurred the exhausted roan gelding back out into the storm. Town was only 2 miles away, but in a Wyoming blizzard, 2 miles could be a death sentence. Wyatt didn't care. He rode like the devil was on his heels. A single kerosene lamp burned in the window of the small clapboard building at the edge of town. A wooden sign swung violently in the wind above the porch. Clara Hayes, nurse and midwife. Clara was at her desk, grinding dried willow bark in a mortar when the front door burst open, carrying a violent swirl of snow into her pristine clinic. She shot to her feet, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron poker by the stove. Wyatt Sterling stood in the doorway. He looked like a wild mountain man, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with melting ice, his broad chest heaving. Clara froze. The iron poker slipped an inch in her grip. "Wyatt, I need your help," he gasped out. Clara's spine stiffened. It had been 5 years since this man had spoken to her. 5 years since that horrific night when she had tried to save his hemorrhaging wife, only to fail. Wyatt hadn't blamed her out loud. He had just looked at her with eyes so dead and hollow that it had broken her heart. And then he had ordered her off his land, completely shutting her and the rest of the town out of his grief-stricken life. "You made it perfectly clear you never wanted me on Sterling property again, Mr. Sterling," Clara said, her voice steady despite the sudden, erratic thumping of her pulse. She was 26 now, independent, and she didn't have time to be haunted by ghosts. "It's not for me. Wyatt stepped forward, the snow melting off his boots onto her clean floorboards. His eyes, usually as cold as steel, were wide and desperate. "It's a baby. And a boy. I found them half frozen in the snow out by the ridge. The parents are dead. Silas Thorne's work." Clara's breath hitched. The bitterness of the past evaporated instantly, replaced by the fierce protective instinct of a frontier nurse. She didn't ask another question. She grabbed her heavy medical leather bag from the table, threw on her thick wool cloak, and pushed past him into the storm. "I'm taking my mare. Ride ahead and break the trail," she yelled over the roaring wind. The ride back was a blur of biting ice and blinding white. When they finally burst through the door of the Sterling cabin, the fire was roaring, but the silence in the room was deafening. Clara threw off her snow-caked cloak and dropped to her knees beside the pallet. She took one look at the blue-tinged infant and went to work. "Get me warm water, not boiling, just warm. And clean towels," Clara ordered, her voice cutting through Wyatt's rising panic like a sharp knife. Wyatt moved instantly, obeying her commands without a second thought. Clara stripped the damp, freezing rags off the baby. She took the warm towels Wyatt handed her and began to vigorously but gently massage the infant's chest and limbs, forcing the blood to circulate. Wyatt knelt beside her, watching her work. In the golden light of the kerosene lamp, Clara looked like an angel of mercy. A stray curl of honey-brown hair had escaped her severe bun, brushing against her flushed cheek. Her hands were small but remarkably strong, moving with a confident grace that mesmerized him. "She's too cold, Wyatt. The towels aren't enough," Clara said, her brow furrowing with worry. "We need body heat, skin to skin." Without a word, Wyatt unbuttoned his flannel shirt, pulling it open to expose his broad, scarred chest. "Give her to me." Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second, her amber eyes flicking up to his face. Then she gently transferred the fragile, shivering infant against Wyatt's bare skin, pulling the heavy wool blankets tightly around them both. As she tucked the blanket over his shoulder, her knuckles grazed his collarbone. A jolt of electricity, sharp and undeniable, sparked at the point of contact. Wyatt's breath caught, and for a moment, the blizzard outside faded away entirely. Clara's eyes widened slightly, her hand lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary before she pulled away, clearing her throat. I need to check on the boy," she stammered, turning her attention to Leo. Wyatt sat motionless by the fire, holding the tiny weight of the baby against his heart. He closed his eyes, praying to a God he had stopped believing in 5 years ago. "Please, don't let her die in this cabin. Don't let death take another one." 10 agonizing minutes passed. The only sound was the crackle of the pine logs. Then Wyatt felt a tiny flutter against his ribs, a small, weak cough, then another, and finally the most beautiful sound Wyatt had ever heard erupted in the quiet cabin, a loud, furious, demanding wail of a newborn baby. Clara spun around from Leo's side, a brilliant, breathtaking smile breaking across her face. "She's crying! Wyatt, she's got her color back!" Wyatt looked down at the screaming infant, her cheeks flushing a healthy, vibrant pink. A heavy, suffocating weight lifted off Wyatt's chest. He looked up at Clara, and for the first time in half a decade, the corners of his mouth twitched upward into a genuine smile. "You did it, Clara," he whispered. "We did it," she corrected softly, her gaze locked with his. By midnight, the storm had finally broken, leaving the Wyoming plains buried under 3 feet of silent, glittering snow. The cabin was suffocatingly warm now. Clara had managed to get Leo to drink some warm broth before the exhausted boy fell into a deep, heavy sleep on a makeshift bed near the hearth. Lily was safely tucked into a padded crate, her stomach full of warm, diluted goat's milk Wyatt had fetched from the barn, sleeping soundly. Wyatt stood near the kitchen counter, watching Clara wipe down her medical instruments. "You can take my bed," Wyatt offered quietly. "I'll take the chair." "I'm fine by the fire, Wyatt. I need to monitor their breathing anyway," Clara replied without looking at him. The adrenaline had worn off, and the awkward, heavy history between them was creeping back into the small space. Before Wyatt could argue, a blood-curdling scream shattered the peaceful silence. "No, Pa, don't let them! No!" Wyatt spun around. On the floor, Leo was thrashing violently in his blankets, his eyes squeezed shut, trapped in the grip of a horrific night terror. He was reliving the massacre in the snow. Wyatt froze, his chest tightening. He didn't know how to comfort a child. He didn't know how to fix broken things. But Clara did. She was across the room in a second, dropping to her knees. She didn't hesitate. She gathered the thrashing, screaming 8-year-old into her arms, pulling his head to her chest. "Shh, Leo, I've got you. You're safe," she murmured softly, rocking him back and forth. Leo fought her wildly for a moment, his small fist striking her shoulder, but Clara held on, absorbing his pain. Slowly she began to sing. It was an old Appalachian lullaby, her voice sweet, low, and incredibly mournful, filling the empty rafters of the cabin. "Oh, Shenandoah, I hear you calling. Away, you rolling river." The haunting melody wrapped around the room like a warm embrace. Slowly, the fight drained out of the boy. His screams dissolved into broken, wrenching sobs. He buried his face in Clara's neck, his small hands clutching the fabric of her dress like a lifeline. Standing in the shadows of the doorway, Wyatt watched them. He watched the firelight dance across Clara's gentle profile as she rocked the orphaned boy. He listened to the sound of a woman's voice singing in a home that had known nothing but deafening silence and bitter memories for 5 long years. A sudden, sharp pain hit Wyatt directly in the center of his chest. It wasn't the dull, familiar ache of grief. It was the agonizing, painful cracking of ice. He looked around his stark, empty cabin. The dusty shelves, the solitary chair, the sheer, profound loneliness of the life he had built to protect himself. He had thought he was surviving, but looking at Clara holding that broken boy, Wyatt Sterling realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't surviving. He had just been a ghost haunting his own life. And for the first time since his wife died, Wyatt desperately wanted to be alive. For 3 days, the blizzard held the Sterling Ranch hostage. The world outside the cabin was a howling, impenetrable wall of white, effectively cutting them off from the rest of the Wyoming territory. Inside, however, the heavy oak walls contained a shifting, pressurized heat that had nothing to do with the roaring fire in the hearth. Wyatt Sterling was a man accustomed to vast, empty spaces. Having Clara Hayes moving through his kitchen, her skirts brushing against his boots, the scent of her lavender soap mingling with the smell of wood smoke and coffee, was doing dangerous things to his deeply buried sanity. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally began to settle into a low, mournful hum. Wyatt stood by the cast-iron stove, pouring a cup of black coffee. He watched covertly as Clara tested the temperature of the water in a galvanized tin basin set on the heavy wooden table. Baby Lily was fussing, her tiny fists waving in the air. "The water's perfect, but she's slippery," Clara said, her amber eyes flicking up to meet his. She looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath her eyes, but to Wyatt she had never looked more beautiful. "Wyatt, I need an extra set of hands. Could you hold her head and shoulders while I wash her?" Wyatt stiffened, his coffee cup pausing halfway to his mouth. "Me? Clara, my hands are like sandpaper. I break horses. I don't wash babies." Clara offered a tired, challenging half-smile. "She won't break, Mr. Sterling. Come here. I won't let you drop her." Reluctantly, Wyatt set his mug down and stepped up beside her. The kitchen felt suddenly impossibly small. He rolled up the sleeves of his thermal shirt, exposing thick forearms corded with muscle and silver scars. Carefully, treating the infant like she was made of blown glass, he slid his large, calloused palms beneath Lily's tiny neck and shoulders. "Like this?" His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "Perfect," Clara whispered. She leaned in to sponge the warm water over the baby's chest. As she did, her soft, capable hand accidentally brushed against Wyatt's knuckles. A jolt of heat shot up Wyatt's arm, straight to his chest. He inhaled sharply. Clara froze, her hand still resting atop his. for a long, agonizing heartbeat. Neither of them moved. The only sound in this cabin was the crackle of the fire and the soft cooing of the baby splashing in the basin. Wyatt looked down, his gaze catching Clara's. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated in the dim morning light. Her lips parted slightly. The air between them grew thick, charged with the heavy, unspoken weight of a 5-year-old grudge dissolving into something entirely different, something primitive and terrifyingly powerful. My pa used to look at my ma like that. Wyatt and Clara sprang apart as if they'd been burned. Standing in the hallway, wrapped in a quilt, was Leo. The 8-year-old boy was watching them with an expression far too old for his face. Clara immediately cleared her throat, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson as she grabbed a towel for the baby. Wyatt took a step back, his jaw clenching as he tried to rein in his racing pulse. "You hungry, kid?" Wyatt asked gruffly, turning his attention to the cast-iron skillet. "I've got bacon and biscuits left over." Leo didn't answer right away. He walked slowly to the table, his gray eyes scanning the cabin, taking in the warm fire, his clean sleeping sister, and the 2 adults who had pulled them from the ice. Finally, he looked at Wyatt. "You buried them?" Leo asked, his voice deadened by trauma. "My folks?" Wyatt stopped wiping his hands on a rag. He met the boy's gaze squarely. He wasn't going to lie to him. The frontier didn't tolerate liars. "The ground is frozen solid, Leo. I couldn't dig, but I gathered stones from the ridge. I built a cairn over them. They're safe from the wolves. I promise you that." Leo stared at him for a long time. Then his small shoulders slumped, a fraction of the tension leaving his brittle frame. He nodded once. "Thank you," the boy whispered. He walked over to the wooden peg by the door where his torn, oversized coat hung drying. He reached deep into a hidden slit in the lining, his small fingers retrieving something wrapped in oilcloth. He walked back and placed it on the table between Wyatt and Clara. "My pa said this was a death warrant," Leo said quietly. "But he said it was the only way to stop them." Wyatt frowned. He unwrapped the oilcloth, revealing a small, black, leather-bound ledger. He opened it. The pages were filled with meticulous, cramped handwriting, names, dates, acreages, and massive sums of money. Clara leaned over Wyatt's shoulder to look, her brow furrowing. "What is this?" "My pa was an accountant in Cheyenne," Leo explained, his voice trembling slightly but his gaze steady. "He was hired by Silas Thorne to fix his books. But Pa found out what Thorne was really doing. Thorne wasn't just buying land. He was forcing ranchers into debt. And when they couldn't pay," Leo swallowed hard, "he killed them. Made it look like accidents or rustler attacks. Then he forged the deeds. Wyatt's blood ran cold. He flipped a page. There, clearly documented, were the payoffs. "Good God," Wyatt breathed out. "He's bribing the county judges. And look here." Wyatt pointed a thick finger at a recurring name in the margin, next to large cash withdrawals. "Sheriff Miller." "The sheriff is on Thorne's payroll," Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Pa stole the ledger," Leo continued, tears finally pooling in his eyes. "We were running for the U.S. Marshal's office in Laramie, but the storm hit. We broke a wheel, and then Thorne's men caught up to us." The boy furiously wiped a tear from his cheek. "He shot Pa, but Pa had already hid the book in my coat and told me to run into the brush. They didn't find it. They thought Ma had it on her when she—" Leo broke off with a sob. Clara immediately stepped forward, pulling the boy into a fierce hug, pressing his face into her apron. Wyatt stared at the ledger, the pieces clicking together with terrifying clarity. The chipped horseshoe print in the snow. The empty strongbox. Silas Thorne and Sheriff Miller owned this territory. And right now, Wyatt was harboring the only piece of evidence that could hang them both, along with the only living eyewitness. They weren't just taking care of orphans anymore. They were sitting on a powder keg. "I need to check the perimeter," Wyatt said abruptly, his voice dangerously low. He grabbed his Winchester rifle and his heavy coat, stepping out into the biting cold. The storm had finally broken. The sky was a brilliant, blinding blue, and the snow was a pristine, unbroken sea of white. At least it should have been unbroken. Wyatt walked down the porch steps, his boots crunching loudly in the frozen silence. Something was wrong. The air was too still. "Duke!" Wyatt whistled sharply for his massive Anatolian shepherd, a dog fierce enough to take down a mountain lion. Usually, Duke would be bounding through the drifts to greet him. Nothing. Wyatt's grip tightened on his rifle. He waded through the snow toward the barn. Halfway there, he found Duke. The massive dog was lying on his side in the snow. Wyatt's heart dropped, but as he knelt, he saw the dog's chest rising and falling in a deep, unnatural sleep. Beside the dog's muzzle was a half-eaten chunk of raw beef, drugged. Wyatt stood up, his eyes scanning the property. The heavy, iron-reinforced main gate of the ranch, which Wyatt had chained shut 3 days ago, was swung wide open, the chain neatly sheared by bolt cutters. But it was what he saw next that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Leading from the open gate were a set of fresh tracks, heavy steel-toed boots. They didn't head toward the barn to steal horses. They didn't head to the smokehouse for food. Wyatt followed the tracks with his eyes, the blood in his veins turning to ice. The boot prints walked in a slow, deliberate line straight up to the side of the cabin. They stopped directly beneath the frosted glass of the bedroom window. The exact room where Leo and Lily had been sleeping last night. The snow on the windowsill was brushed away, indicating someone had stood there looking in. Then the tracks turned and walked calmly back out the front gate. Wyatt stared at the footprints, a cold, suffocating dread settling over him. Silas Thorne hadn't attacked them in the night because he didn't want a messy shootout in a blizzard. He wanted to send a message, a psychological twisting of the knife. Thorne knew exactly where the children were. Wyatt looked at the window, hearing Clara's soft, distant laughter from inside the cabin as she comforted Leo. He gripped his rifle until his knuckles turned white. "We can get to them in their beds," the silent footprints screamed, "and there is nothing you can do to stop us." Wyatt didn't tell Clara about the footprints immediately. He walked back into the cabin, his face carved from unyielding granite, and went straight to the gun cabinet. He pulled out a box of 44-40 cartridges, his movements sharp and violently precise, as he began feeding them into the side gate of his Winchester repeater. Clara watched him from the stove, the wooden spoon in her hand pausing. The warm, domestic illusion of the morning shattered instantly. "Wyatt?" she asked, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "What is it?" He didn't look up. He couldn't. If he looked into her amber eyes right now, he might lose the cold, calculated edge he needed to keep them all alive. "Thorne knows they're here. He sent a scout last night, drugged Duke, and walked right up to the window." Clara inhaled sharply. She instinctively stepped sideways, putting her body between the window and the crate where baby Lily was sleeping. Leo, sitting at the table, went entirely rigid, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his tin cup of water. Are they coming back?" Leo asked, his voice paper-thin. Wyatt finally looked at the boy. He racked the lever of the Winchester, the heavy metallic clack echoing off the log walls. "Not if they know what's good for them. Nobody takes you from this ranch, Leo. You have my word on that." But Wyatt knew his word, no matter how fiercely given, meant nothing to a bullet, or worse, the law. The low, rhythmic crunch of hooves on packed snow reached his ears before the riders cleared the ridge. Wyatt's head snapped toward the door. Duke, recovering from the drugged meat, let out a groggy, low growl from his spot by the hearth. "Stay inside," Wyatt ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "Keep away from the windows." Wyatt stepped out onto the porch, the freezing Wyoming wind immediately biting through his flannel shirt. He didn't bother with his coat. He wanted them to see the rifle. He wanted them to see the man holding it. 3 riders brought their horses to a halt at the edge of the yard. 2 of them were hired guns wearing dusters that couldn't hide the heavy revolvers strapped to their thighs. But the man in the center wore a tin star pinned to his lapel. Sheriff Miller. Miller was a man who smiled too much, his eyes remaining as flat and dead as a snake's. He tipped his Stetson back, his gaze sweeping over the burned-out remains of Wyatt's eastern fence line, before landing on the rancher. "Morning, Sterling," Miller called out, his voice dripping with false amiability. "Hell of a storm we just had." "State your business, Miller. You're trespassing." Wyatt didn't raise the rifle, but he held it at the ready, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard. Miller feigned a look of wounded pride. He reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a folded piece of heavy parchment. "No need to be hostile, Wyatt. I'm here on official county business. It's a tragedy, truly. We found the Callaway wagon out by the ridge. Appears they fell victim to the elements." "They fell victim to lead," Wyatt fired back, his voice like cracking ice. "And you know it." Miller's smile didn't falter, but his dead eyes hardened. "Now that's a dangerous accusation to throw around. The coroner ruled it exposure, but that ain't why I'm here. Word reached town that you took in the 2 orphans who survived the wreck." Wyatt's jaw locked. Word reached town. Silas Thorne had sent his lapdog to do his dirty work legally. "They're recovering," Wyatt said flatly. "They'll stay here." "I'm afraid that ain't how the law works," Miller sighed, tapping the parchment against his saddle horn. "I got a court order right here from Judge Higgins. The children are officially wards of the territory. I'm here to transport them to the state orphanage in Cheyenne." Wyatt knew exactly what that meant. The children would never make it to Cheyenne. They would be handed over to Silas Thorne before they even crossed the county line. The ledger would be burned and the kids would disappear. "Over my dead body," Wyatt growled, finally raising the Winchester, the barrel aimed squarely at the center of Miller's chest. The 2 hired guns behind Miller instantly reached for their holsters. "Hold it!" Miller barked at his men, though he looked visibly nervous. He looked back at Wyatt. "You want to hang, Sterling? You shoot a lawman, you're done. Your ranch is forfeit. And I'm taking those kids anyway. You have no legal right to them. You're a single man, no blood relation, living in the middle of nowhere. No judge in the country would let a bachelor raise an 8-year-old and a newborn." Before Wyatt could respond, the heavy cabin door creaked open behind him. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She had thrown her wool shawl over her shoulders, her chin tilted up in a defiant, regal angle. "Mr. Sterling is not alone in caring for them, Sheriff," Clara stated, her voice ringing clear and authoritative across the snowy yard. "I am a registered nurse. The children are under my medical supervision, and they are not fit for travel." Miller's smarmy smile returned, wider this time. "Ah, Miss Hayes. I was wondering whose horse that was in the barn. Town's been buzzing about you spending 3 nights unchaperoned with a widower." Clara flushed, but didn't back down. "There was a blizzard, Miller. I was doing my job." "Funny you should mention your job," Miller said, leaning forward in his saddle. "The town council had a little emergency meeting yesterday morning. Fact is, a lot of folks are feeling uneasy about a young, unmarried woman running a medical practice all by her lonesome. It breeds, impropriety. Like what we're looking at right now." He sneered down at her. "Council voted. By Friday, your clinic license is being permanently revoked. The bank is seizing the building. Unless you got a husband to vouch for your character and take over your lease, you're out of business, Clara." Clara gasped, the color draining from her face. Her clinic was her entire life. It was the independence she had fought tooth and nail to build. Wyatt felt the trap springing shut around them. It was a perfectly orchestrated pincer movement by Silas Thorne. Use the law to take the kids. Use the law to destroy Clara for helping them. Wyatt stood frozen on the porch. If he pulled the trigger, he'd kill Miller, but he'd die in the ensuing shootout with the deputies. Then Clara and the kids would be defenseless. If he surrendered, he was handing Leo and Lily over to their executioners, and Clara would be ruined. He was cornered. The law belonged to the outlaws. Wyatt lowered the Winchester inch by inch. Miller's smile widened in triumph. "Smart boy, Sterling," Miller mocked. "Now go fetch the brats." Wyatt didn't move toward the door. Instead, he turned his back on the sheriff entirely. He looked at Clara. She was trembling, staring at the ground, the crushing weight of Miller's words breaking her spirit. Through the crack in the open doorway, Wyatt could see Leo. The boy was holding baby Lily tightly to his chest. His terrified gray eyes locked on Wyatt, waiting for the rancher to save them. Wyatt looked back at Clara. His heart hammered a violent, reckless rhythm against his ribs. It was the craziest, most desperate thought he'd ever had. But it was the only way out. "Clara," Wyatt said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying only to her. She looked up, her amber eyes shimmering with unshed tears of frustration. Wyatt took a step closer, invading her space, his towering frame shielding her from the sight of the men in the yard. "Marry me," Wyatt said. Clara blinked, her breath hitching. "What?" "Marry me, Clara. Tomorrow," Wyatt repeated, his gaze intense, burning with a fierce protective fire. He spoke rapidly, the raw edge of desperation bleeding into his tone. "A bachelor can't keep these kids, but a family can. No judge will hand orphans to the state if a respectable married couple petitions to adopt them. And a married woman keeps her clinic." Clara stared at him, entirely speechless. The wind whipped her honey-brown hair across her face. "Wyatt, you can't be serious. We can't just—" "Look at me," Wyatt demanded softly. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently lifting her chin so she had no choice but to meet his eyes. "Miller's going to take them, Clara. He's going to hand them to Thorne, and we both know what happens after that. I can't let that happen. And I won't let them take your livelihood. We sign a paper. We say some words. It's a business arrangement, a shield." Clara's heart hammered a frantic tattoo against her ribs. Marry Wyatt Sterling, the man who had broken her heart 5 years ago by shutting her out. The man who had spent 3 days looking at her with a heavy, simmering heat that made her blood hum. She looked past his broad shoulder out into the yard where Sheriff Miller was waiting with a smug, victorious grin. Then she looked back through the doorway at Leo, the little boy who had risked freezing to death to save his sister. She couldn't let them die. And heaven help her, she didn't want to leave this ranch. Clara turned her gaze back to Wyatt. The walls he had built around his heart for 5 years were gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading vulnerability that stole her breath. "Yes," Clara whispered, the single word hanging in the freezing air between them like a vow. "I'll marry you." Wyatt let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a lifetime. He turned back around to face the yard, his posture shifting from a cornered animal to an immovable mountain. He raised the Winchester again, resting it casually over his forearm. "You're riding off my land empty-handed, Miller," Wyatt declared, his voice booming with absolute authority. Miller scowled, his hand dropping to his pistol. "I have a court order, Sterling. And I have a wedding tomorrow," Wyatt shot back, a fierce feral grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Miss Hayes and I are getting married. By Friday morning, my lawyer in Cheyenne will file the formal adoption papers for those children under a married 2-parent household. Your order is for an emergency ward of the state. It's null and void if they have a family." Miller's face turned an ugly shade of purple. He realized instantly he had been outmaneuvered. He couldn't shoot a respected rancher and his new bride in cold blood without bringing the U.S. Marshals down on his own head. "Thorne ain't gonna like this," Miller spat, abandoning the pretense of the law. "You tell Silas Thorne," Wyatt said, cocking the hammer of his rifle with a lethal metallic click, "that if he steps foot on Sterling land, I'll bury him in the snow right next to his horseshoe prints. Now get off my property before I decide I don't care about hanging." Miller glared at them with a hatred so pure it seemed to curdle the air. He yanked his horse's reins hard. "This ain't over, Sterling." Wyatt stood on the porch, Clara's shoulder brushing against his arm, and watched the 3 riders turn and gallop back toward town. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. But as Wyatt felt the slight, trembling warmth of Clara standing beside him, he knew one thing for certain. Silas Thorne was going to have to go through hell to take what was his. Reverend Josiah Stokes looked entirely out of his element standing on the frost-heaved planks of the Sterling porch, his breath pluming in the crisp morning air. He clutched his worn leather Bible with red, freezing fingers, his eyes darting nervously between the heavily armed rancher and the town's fiercely independent nurse. Word had been sent to town at first light. By noon, the preacher had arrived, escorted by one of Wyatt's returning ranch hands, who had orders not to take no for an answer. Clara stood beside Wyatt, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She hadn't packed a wedding dress when she rode out into the blizzard 3 days ago. She wore her simple dark blue wool skirt and a practical white cotton blouse, her honey-brown hair pinned up neatly. In her trembling hands, she held a makeshift bouquet of dried sagebrush and green pine sprigs, a gift Leo had solemnly presented to her just moments before. Wyatt stood tall and rigid. He had shaved the coarse stubble from his jaw and donned a clean-pressed black shirt. He looked every inch the formidable, unyielding frontiersman. But when Clara risked a glance at his profile, she saw the tight clench of his jaw and the heavy pulse beating at the base of his throat. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Stokes began, his voice shivering over the wind. "We are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman." The words washed over Clara in a surreal haze. A business arrangement, Wyatt had called it. A shield. Yet, as the preacher spoke of honor, protection, and forsaking all others, the air between her and Wyatt grew incredibly dense. "Do you, Wyatt Thomas Sterling, take this woman?" "I do," Wyatt said. His voice wasn't a hesitant mumble. It was a deep, gravelly vow that resonated in his chest and seemed to anchor the very cabin behind them. "And do you, Clara Ann Hayes, take this man?" Followed, Clara looked at Leo, who was standing by the door holding a swaddled sleeping Lily. The boy offered her a small, hopeful smile, the first real smile she had seen on his face. She looked back up into Wyatt's piercing blue eyes. There was a storm of unspoken emotion swirling in their depths. Fear, duty, and a fierce, burning protectiveness. "I do," Clara breathed, her voice steady. "The ring?" Reverend Stokes asked gently. Clara hadn't expected one, but Wyatt reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple, gleaming band of solid gold. It had belonged to his mother. He took Clara's left hand, his large, rough fingers surprisingly gentle as they supported her wrist. As he slid the cold gold over her knuckle, the stark contrast between his battle-scarred hands and her smaller, pale fingers made her breath catch. "I pronounce you husband and wife," Stokes declared, looking profoundly relieved to be finished. "You may kiss the bride." Clara froze. They hadn't discussed this part of the arrangement. Wyatt turned fully toward her. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before lifting his hands to frame her face. His calluses scraped softly against her cheeks. He leaned down, and Clara closed her eyes. It was meant to be brief, a seal on a contract. But the moment Wyatt's warm, firm lips pressed against hers, a violent tremor shot through them both. It wasn't a chaste peck. Wyatt lingered, his mouth slanting slightly over hers, drawing a quiet, involuntary gasp from her throat. For one blinding second, he tasted like coffee, winter wind, and a desperate, raw hunger. When he pulled back, his eyes were dilated, his chest rising and falling heavily. Clara stared at him, her lips tingling, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Business arrangement," she reminded herself frantically. "Right." The next few days settled into a strange domestic rhythm that transformed the Sterling Ranch completely. Wyatt's lawyer in Cheyenne filed the paperwork via telegraph. Legally, the children were safe. As a married woman, under the protection of a prominent landowner, the town council immediately dropped their threats against Clara's clinic. She was untouchable. But inside the cabin, the lines were much more complicated. Clara breathed life back into the dead space. She threw open the heavy shutters, letting the brilliant winter sun flood the dusty corners. She filled the air with the scent of baking bread and roasting venison. She coaxed Leo into helping her chop vegetables, rewarding him with stories and a bright musical laugh that echoed off the log walls. Wyatt found himself lingering by the door before heading out to the barn just to watch them. He was terrified. He had spent 5 years meticulously building a fortress of solitude, so he would never have to feel the agony of loss again. And in a matter of days, Clara and these 2 orphans had dismantled it completely. He caught himself watching the way her hips swayed as she walked across the kitchen. He noticed the way the firelight caught the golden strands in her hair, and worse, he noticed how other men looked at her. On Thursday afternoon, Billy, the 19-year-old clerk from the town mercantile, drove a supply wagon up to the porch. As Clara stepped out to sign the receipt, the cold wind whipped her shawl back. Billy's eyes widened, lingering entirely too long on the curve of her waist, a love-struck flush creeping up his neck. "Morning, Miss Clara. Mrs. Sterling," Billy stammered, practically tripping over a sack of flour to get closer to her. "You're looking mighty pretty today. I brought those extra blankets you asked for." Wyatt appeared from the barn like a dark, looming thundercloud. He didn't say a word, but the sheer, intimidating mass of his presence made the air pressure drop. He stepped up onto the porch, deliberately placing himself between the blushing clerk and Clara. Wyatt dropped a heavy, leather-gloved hand onto the porch post. He looked down at Billy with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. "Much obliged for the delivery, Billy," Wyatt rumbled, the subtle, lethal warning in his tone unmistakable. "My wife and I can take it from here." Billy went pale, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir, Mr. Sterling." "Have a good day, sir." He scrambled onto his wagon and whipped the mules into a frantic trot back down the trail. Clara covered her mouth to hide a smile, turning back toward the door. "You didn't have to scare the poor boy to death, Wyatt." "He was looking at what isn't his," Wyatt grunted, grabbing the 50-pound sack of flour as if it weighed nothing. He didn't add the rest of the thought. "You're mine." Because she wasn't. Not really. The hardest part of the arrangement came when the sun went down. The cabin only had one heated bedroom. For the first 2 nights, Wyatt had stubbornly taken a bedroll on the hard plank floor, claiming he was used to sleeping on the trail. But by the 3rd night, Clara had put her foot down. She refused to let him freeze on the floor while she took his massive feather bed. They compromised with a rolled-up quilt running straight down the middle of the mattress. It was torture. Wyatt lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling timbers, listening to the soft rhythmic sound of Clara's breathing just inches away. He could smell her lavender soap. He could feel the heat radiating from her small body across the quilt divide. Every time she shifted in her sleep, rustling the cotton sheets, Wyatt's muscles pulled taut with a heavy primal ache. He wanted to pull that quilt away. He wanted to pull her into his arms and bury his face in her hair, but he had promised her a shield, not a cage. He couldn't take advantage of a woman who had only married him to save 2 orphans. By Friday night, the tension was a physical weight in the cabin. The fire had died down to glowing red embers. Outside, the wind whipped snow against the frosted window panes. Clara lay awake, her eyes wide open in the dark. She was hyper-aware of the massive, quiet man lying on the other side of the mattress barrier. She couldn't stop thinking about the fierce way he had protected her from Sheriff Miller, or the surprisingly gentle way he held baby Lily when Clara needed to rest. Unable to stand the suffocating silence, Clara quietly slipped out from under the blankets. The floorboards were freezing against her bare feet. She wrapped her thick woolen shawl over her thin white cotton nightgown and padded softly out to the kitchen, desperate for a cup of mint tea to calm her racing nerves. She lit a single candle on the counter and set the kettle on the cooling iron stove. The tea tins were kept on the highest shelf above the pantry counter. Clara stretched up on her tiptoes, her fingers blindly grazing the edge of the tin, but it was just out of reach. She let out a frustrated sigh, bouncing on her toes to try and knock it forward. A floorboard creaked behind her. Before Clara could turn, a large, calloused hand reached smoothly over her head, effortlessly plucking the tin from the shelf. Clara gasped, freezing in place. Wyatt was standing directly behind her. He hadn't bothered with a shirt. He wore only his faded denim trousers, the silver scars on his broad chest illuminated by the flickering candlelight. He didn't step back. He stayed right where he was, so close that Clara could feel the intense, radiating heat of his bare torso against her back. "Couldn't sleep?" Wyatt's voice was a dark, gravelly whisper that sent a violent shiver straight down her spine. "No," Clara breathed, unable to move. I wanted tea." Wyatt slowly lowered his arm, setting the tin on the counter beside her. But he didn't retreat. He braced his hands on the edge of the counter on either side of her waist, effectively trapping her between the woodwork and his massive frame. The air in the kitchen suddenly became too thin to breathe. "You're shivering," he murmured, his breath brushing the sensitive skin below her ear. "It's cold," she lied. "Is it?" Slowly, giving her every opportunity to push him away, Wyatt stepped closer until his chest lightly brushed against the wool of her shawl. Clara's heart hammered a frantic, desperate beat. She slowly turned around within the cage of his arms. They were inches apart. Wyatt's eyes were dark, fathomless pools of heat in the candlelight. The careful, stoic rancher was gone. In his place was a man burning alive, looking at her with a raw, desperate hunger that made Clara's knees weak. She looked up at his mouth, and all the logical reasons why this was a bad idea vanished. Clara reached up, her small hands resting flat against the hard, scarred muscle of his bare chest. She felt his heart thudding violently beneath her palms. With a low, ragged groan, Wyatt's restraint finally snapped. His hands came up, tangling fiercely into her loose honey-brown hair, tilting her head back. He crashed his mouth down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was visceral, possessive, and entirely consuming. Clara gasped against his lips, and Wyatt took advantage, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, stealing her breath. She didn't push him away. Instead, she let out a soft, surrendered whimper and tangled her fingers in his dark hair, pulling him closer, kissing him back with an equal, desperate fire. Wyatt's powerful arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her effortlessly off the floor until her toes dangled, pressing her soft curves flush against his hard body. The business arrangement shattered into 1,000 irredeemable pieces on the kitchen floor. There was no turning back now. The morning after the kiss in the kitchen, the atmosphere inside the Sterling cabin was thick enough to cut with a Bowie knife. Wyatt had been outside since before dawn, violently splitting a cord of firewood in the freezing air, his breath pluming in white clouds. Every swing of the heavy iron maul was an attempt to exercise the fierce, primal possessiveness that had taken root in his chest. The taste of Clara was still branded on his lips. The memory of her soft, yielding curves pressed against him made his blood roar. He had promised her a business arrangement, a shield. He hadn't meant to cross the line. But looking at her now, he knew he could never go back. Inside the cabin, Clara was bustling around the stove, her cheeks permanently flushed. Every time Wyatt stepped through the door carrying an armful of wood, the heavy, unspoken weight of what had happened hung between them. Neither had mentioned the kiss, but the shift in their dynamic was undeniable. The way Wyatt handed her a coffee cup, his fingers deliberately lingering against hers. The way Clara didn't pull away. But the harsh reality of the frontier didn't allow for long, quiet mornings of romantic contemplation. They were out of baby formula. Leo needed a heavier winter coat, and Clara needed medical supplies from her clinic. Wyatt left his most trusted and heavily armed ranch hand, Caleb, at the cabin with strict orders. "You bolt the door. You keep the Winchester loaded. If anyone rides up that you don't recognize, you shoot first and ask questions when I get back." Caleb, a grizzled veteran of the plains, nodded grimly, patting the rifle. "Nobody touches these kids, boss." The ride into town was quiet. Clara sat close to Wyatt on the wagon bench, the heavy buffalo robe draped over their laps. Beneath the thick fur, the side of her leg was pressed firmly against his thigh. Wyatt didn't shift away. He drove the team of draft horses with one hand, his other arm resting casually across the back of the wooden bench, just inches from Clara's shoulders. The muddy, snow-slushed main street of town was bustling when they arrived. The news of the sudden Sterling marriage had clearly spread like wildfire. As Wyatt helped Clara down from the wagon, his hands spanning her small waist, heads turned. Whispers erupted from the boardwalks. Clara kept her chin high, smoothing her wool skirt. She was a proud woman, and she had spent years building her reputation as the town's dependable nurse. But small towns were notoriously cruel to women who broke the mold, and marrying a reclusive, dangerous rancher overnight was practically scandalous. They walked into the crowded mercantile. The smell of oiled leather, coffee beans, and peppermint hung in the warm air. The chatter inside abruptly died down the moment Wyatt's heavy boots crossed the threshold. Clara moved toward the dry goods counter to order the infant supplies, pulling a written list from her pocket. Wyatt hung back near the door, his eyes scanning the room, assessing every man in the building out of ingrained lethal habit. Near the pot-belly stove, a group of rough-looking men were lounging. Wyatt recognized them immediately. They were Silas Thorne's hired guns. The loudest of the bunch was a massive, scarred brute named Dirk Vance, a man known for a fast draw and a filthy mouth. Vance spat a stream of chewing tobacco into a brass spittoon and loudly cleared his throat. "Well, well," Vance drawled, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet store. He looked Clara up and down with an insulting, predatory sneer. "Looks like the high and mighty town nurse finally figured out a way to pay her rent." Clara stiffened, her hand freezing over her supply list. Vance laughed, elbowing the man next to him. "Ain't it amazing how fast a woman's morals drop when the bank comes knocking? Guess she decided opening her legs for the Sterling widower was easier than packing her bags. Bought herself a nice warm roof, didn't you, sweetheart?" A few of the men chuckled darkly. The store clerk looked terrified, sinking lower behind the counter. Clara's face flushed with a mixture of profound humiliation and blazing anger. She opened her mouth to snap back, her spine rigid with defiance. But before she could speak, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Wyatt moved. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He walked across the wooden floorboards with the slow, deliberate, terrifying grace of a predator that had just cornered its prey. The crowd parted instantly, men stepping over themselves to get out of his path. Wyatt stopped 3 feet away from Vance. The hired gun was tall, but Wyatt Sterling was a mountain of solid muscle and unyielding frontier grit. Wyatt didn't throw a punch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply rested his right hand casually on the grips of the Colt .45 strapped to his thigh. The silence in the mercantile was absolute. "Vance," Wyatt said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated the floorboards. It was the calm before a devastating storm. "I'm going to give you exactly 3 seconds to apologize to my wife." Vance's arrogant sneer faltered. He looked at the Colt, then up into Wyatt's eyes. What he saw there made the color drain completely from his scarred face. Wyatt's eyes were dead, flat, and entirely merciless. This wasn't a man looking for a bar brawl. This was a man looking for a reason to kill. "Now, hold on, Sterling," Vance stammered, taking a small step back, his hands rising defensively. "I was just making a joke." "1," Wyatt counted softly, the hammer of his Colt clicking back with a sharp, deafening snap under his thumb. Vance swallowed hard, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the winter chill. The other hired guns had suddenly found the floorboards incredibly interesting, none of them making a move to back Vance up. Silas Thorne paid them well, but nobody wanted to die over a crude comment in a general store. 2. All right, Vance raised his hands higher, looking over at Clara. "I spoke out of turn. My apologies, ma'am. I meant no disrespect to you or your husband." Wyatt stared at the man for one more agonizing second, ensuring the absolute dominance of the moment sank into the minds of every person in the room. Then, very slowly, Wyatt eased the hammer of his gun down. He didn't look at Vance anymore. He turned his imposing frame, his gaze sweeping over the silent crowd, locking eyes with the townsfolk who had been whispering just minutes before. "Clara Hayes is a sterling now." Wyatt's voice rang out, authoritative and unshakable. "She is the heart of my ranch, and she is my family. You look at her with respect, you speak to her with respect. If any man, woman, or lawman in this county has a problem with that, you don't whisper about it. You come out to the Double S and say it to my face." No one breathed a word. The message was received loud and crystal clear. Wyatt Sterling was no longer a grieving hermit. He was a husband protecting his own, and heaven help the fool who tested him. Wyatt walked over to the counter, gently placed his hand on the small of Clara's back, and looked at the trembling clerk. "Put the supplies on my tab, Henry, and load the wagon." The sun was beginning its low descent over the Bighorn Mountains as the wagon rumbled back down the trail toward the ranch. The silence between Wyatt and Clara was different now. It wasn't thick with awkward tension. It was heavy with a profound, shifting realization. Clara looked at the man driving the team next to her. Her heart was still fluttering from the sheer masculine authority he had displayed in the mercantile. He hadn't just defended her honor. He had claimed her in front of the entire world. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said softly, the wind catching her words. "I've dealt with men like Dirk Vance before. I can fight my own battles." Wyatt kept his eyes on the snowy road, his jaw tight. "I know you can. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, Clara. But you shouldn't have to." He turned his head, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "You're my wife. Even if it started as paper, you wear my name. I protect what's mine." The words sent a thrill of heat straight to Clara's core. I protect what's mine. The business arrangement was officially dead, buried under the snow. She reached across the wooden seat, her small, gloved hand resting over his large, leather-clad one holding the reins. Wyatt exhaled a shaky breath and turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers, holding on tight. For a mile, there was peace. The fading sunlight painted the snow-covered plains in brilliant strokes of gold and violet. But as they crested the final ridge overlooking the Sterling Ranch, the horses suddenly whinnied, tossing their heads in panic. Wyatt's grip on Clara's hand tightened like a vice. His head snapped up. The peace of the evening was a lie. The smell hit them first. The sharp, acrid stench of burning pine and scorched earth. Down in the valley, the western barn, the one housing Wyatt's prized winter feed and several head of cattle, was a towering inferno. Black smoke billowed into the twilight sky, the flames licking hungrily at the roof beams. Silas Thorne hadn't waited for the sheriff. He had made his move. "Caleb!" Wyatt roared, whipping the reins violently against the draft horses' backs, sending the heavy wagon careening down the snowy slope. "Hold on, Clara." The war had arrived at their doorstep. The heavy draft wagon careened down the snowy slope, the massive wheels skidding and fishtailing on the ice. Wyatt didn't ease up on the reins. His eyes were locked on the towering inferno of the western barn, the flames painting the twilight sky in violent, hellish strokes of orange and black. The roaring crackle of burning timber echoed across the valley, but beneath that sound, Wyatt's seasoned ears picked up something far more deadly. It was too quiet in the yard. No panicked shouts from Caleb, no barking from Duke. "Get down!" Wyatt roared, wrapping one massive arm around Clara's waist and practically shoving her onto the floorboards of the wagon bed. A split second later, the sharp, deafening crack of a Winchester rifle split the air. A bullet shredded the wooden bench exactly where Clara's chest had been a moment before, showering them both in sharp splinters. The draft horses screamed in terror, rearing up in their harnesses. "Hold on to me," Wyatt yelled over the din. He dropped the reins, trusting the panicked horses to run toward the familiar safety of the cabin. He drew his Colt .45 in a single fluid motion, his eyes scanning the tree line illuminated by the fire. Muzzle flashes winked like deadly fireflies from the shadows of the corral and the timberline. Silas Thorne's men weren't just here to burn the ranch. They had laid a trap, using the fire to draw Wyatt out into the open. As the wagon skidded to a violent halt near the cabin porch, the heavy oak door flew open. Caleb stood in the doorway, providing a blistering volley of covering fire from his repeater. "Go! Go!" Caleb bellowed. Wyatt grabbed Clara by the waist, hauling her out of the wagon. He shielded her with his own body, his broad back absorbing the terrifying whiz of lead cutting through the frigid air around them. They hit the porch at a dead run and dove through the doorway. Caleb slammed the heavy door shut behind them, throwing the iron bolt into place just as 2 bullets thudded heavily into the thick exterior wood. The cabin was plunged into a chaotic mix of shadows and the frantic, flickering orange light pouring through the windows from the burning barn. "They hit us 10 minutes ago, boss," Caleb shouted, reloading his rifle with practiced mechanical speed. "Cut the telegraph wire first. Duke's holed up under the porch with a grazed leg. There's at least 6 of them out there." Wyatt didn't hesitate. He pulled Clara to her feet, his hands gripping her shoulders tightly. His eyes frantically swept over her, checking for blood. "Are you hit? Clara, are you hit?" "No," she gasped, her chest heaving, her honey-brown hair falling wildly from its pins. "I'm fine. Where are the children?" "Here!" Leo's voice trembled from the back of the room. The 8-year-old was huddled in the darkest corner of the kitchen, his body curled protectively over the padded crate where baby Lily was miraculously sleeping through the gunfire, though her small face was scrunched in distress. Clara rushed to them, dropping to her knees and pulling Leo into a fierce hug. "You did perfectly, Leo. Stay low. Do not stand up. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Leo whispered, his gray eyes wide with terror, but his jaw set with a courage that defied his age. Wyatt stepped over to the gun cabinet. He tossed a spare Winchester to Caleb and grabbed a second one for himself, filling his pockets with heavy brass cartridges. Then, he grabbed a double-barreled shotgun from the rack and turned to Clara. To his surprise, she was already standing, reaching her hand out for the weapon. Wyatt paused for a fraction of a second, the raw protective instinct warring with his logical mind. But he looked into her amber eyes, fierce, unyielding, and burning with the same desperate need to protect their family. She was a frontier woman. She knew the stakes. He handed her the shotgun and a handful of shells. "Buckshot. Keep your back to the pantry wall. If anyone comes through that door that isn't me or Caleb, you pull both triggers and don't close your eyes." Clara racked the action with a sharp metallic clack. "I won't." Wyatt gave her one last, lingering look, a silent vow that he would die before he let anyone touch her, and then threw himself against the wall beside the front window. He shattered the glass with the butt of his rifle, leveling the barrel into the smoky, illuminated yard. "Take the east window, Caleb. Give them hell!" The cabin erupted into a deafening symphony of gunfire. The smell of sulfur and burning pine instantly filled the confined space. Wyatt fired methodically, tracking the muzzle flashes in the dark. A man near the water trough cried out and fell into the snow, but the others were heavily entrenched. They were using the heavy timber fencing of the Mustang corral for cover, laying down a suppressing fire that was chewing the cabin's log walls to splinters. "We're pinned, Wyatt!" Caleb yelled over the roar of the Winchester. "They've got the angle on us. If they decide to rush the porch with torches, we're cooked." In the corner, Leo heard every word. The boy looked at the shotgun in Clara's trembling but steady hands. He looked at Wyatt, the man who had pulled him from the ice, currently risking his life to hold off an army. He looked down at baby Lily, who had finally woken up and begun to cry. Silas Thorne wanted the ledger. He wanted Leo dead. Because of him, these good people were going to die. Leo's eyes darted toward the pantry. Just beneath the bottom shelf was a heavy wooden trapdoor. Wyatt had shown it to him 2 days ago. "Root cellar," Wyatt had explained. "Draft door leads out behind the firewood stack, right next to the horse corral. Use it if a twister ever touches down." Leo didn't ask for permission. He knew Clara would stop him. While a deafening volley of bullets shattered the remaining panes of the front window, drawing all the adults' attention, Leo slipped silently into the pantry. He lifted the heavy iron ring of the trapdoor, slipping down into the dark, earthy-smelling cellar. He crawled on his hands and knees, the sound of the gun battle muffled by the dirt above him. He reached the slanted wooden draft doors at the end of the tunnel. He pushed one open just a crack. The heat from the burning barn hit him like a physical blow. The snow around the firewood stack was melting into black mud. Just 30 feet away was the heavy iron latch of the Mustang corral. Inside the pen, 24 half-wild Mustangs were screaming in panic, their hooves thrashing against the timber as the fire raged nearby. Leo took a deep breath. Damn. His heart was hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. For Ma, he thought. For Pa, for Lily. He pushed the cellar door open and scrambled out into the snow, keeping his small body pressed flat against the ground. He crawled through the slush, the smoke hiding his small frame from the outlaws exchanging fire with the cabin. He reached the heavy timber posts of the corral. His frozen, trembling fingers reached up and grabbed the freezing iron latch. With a desperate heave, Leo threw the latch back and kicked the heavy gate open. Then he dove headfirst into a deep snowdrift beneath the water trough. The panicked Mustangs didn't hesitate. Seeing the open gate, the herd surged forward in a blind, terrified frenzy. 24 thousand-pound animals exploded out of the corral, a tidal wave of hooves, muscle, and raw panic. They crashed directly through the outlaws' defensive line. Men screamed as the stampede hit them. The sheer chaos of the charging horses sent Silas Thorne's men diving for their lives into the deep snow, their suppressing fire instantly cutting off as they were trampled and scattered. From the cabin window, Wyatt watched the corral gate swing open and the herd obliterate the enemy line. He didn't know how it happened, but he wasn't going to waste the miracle. "Now, Caleb!" Wyatt roared. Wyatt stepped out onto the porch, his Winchester barking a deadly rhythm. Free from the suppressing fire, his aim was flawless. He clipped one outlaw in the shoulder as the man tried to run, sending him sprawling into the mud. Caleb dropped another who was trying to aim his revolver from behind a wagon wheel. The remaining outlaws, realizing their cover was blown and their numbers were falling, broke and ran for the tree line, abandoning the siege. Wyatt stood on the porch, his rifle smoking, his chest heaving as he scanned the retreating figures. The yard was a chaotic mess of trampled snow, groaning men, and burning embers. But a sudden, terrifying realization gripped Wyatt's gut. He had counted the men fleeing. He had counted the men on the ground. None of them wore a long bearskin coat. None of them rode a massive black stallion. Silas Thorne wasn't among them. He hadn't been fighting from the corral. Wyatt spun around, his eyes locking onto the cabin door. He had left Clara guarding the back, the bedroom. Inside the cabin, Clara stood near the kitchen table, her heart racing as the gunfire outside abruptly ceased. She heard the thunder of hooves fading into the distance. She let out a shaky breath, lowering the heavy barrel of the shotgun just a fraction. "Leo, it's over," she called out, turning toward the pantry. "You can come out." She stopped. The corner where Leo had been hiding was empty. Only Lily remained in the crate, wailing softly. "Leo?" Clara stepped forward, panic seizing her anew. From the back bedroom, the sound of a heavy boot crunching on broken glass shattered the silence. Clara whipped around, bringing the shotgun up to her shoulder. A shadow filled the bedroom doorway. Silas Thorne stepped into the flickering light of the kitchen. His face was smeared with soot, his bearskin coat singed, and his eyes burned with a maniacal, cornered fury. He hadn't bothered fighting Wyatt outside. He had used his men as fodder to sneak around to the back of the cabin. Clara's finger tightened on the triggers. But Silas was a man who had survived a decade of frontier violence. Before Clara could even fully brace the weapon against her shoulder, Thorne's arm snapped up with lightning speed. The metallic click of his Colt .45 echoing in the small room was the loudest sound Clara had ever heard. Silas Thorne stood 10 feet away, his breathing ragged, the dark, hollow muzzle of his revolver aimed dead center at Clara's forehead. "Put the scattergun down, Mrs. Sterling," Thorne rasped, a cruel, blood-stained smile twisting his lips. "Or I'll paint these logs with your brains, and then I'll drown that screaming baby in the wash basin." Where's the ledger? Clara stared down the dark, hollow barrel of Silas Thorne's Colt 45. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she didn't lower the heavy shotgun. She couldn't. Behind her, baby Lily was crying in the crate, completely defenseless. "You've lost, Silas," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her hands trembled against the wooden stock of the scattergun. "Your men are running. Wyatt will be through that door in a second. Put the gun down." Silas let out a harsh, barking laugh that dissolved into a wet cough from the smoke. His face was a mask of soot and pure, unadulterated malice. "Sterling is busy chasing ghosts in the yard. By the time he realizes I slipped through the back, you'll be dead. The brat will be quiet, and I'll be riding off with the ledger." He cocked the hammer of his revolver, the metallic click echoing like a death knell in the kitchen. "I won't ask again, little bird. Where is the book?" Clara lifted her chin, her amber eyes blazing with a fierce motherly defiance she hadn't known she possessed. "Go to hell." Silas's eyes narrowed into dark slits. "Ladies first." His finger tightened on the trigger. Behind Silas, the remaining jagged shards of the bedroom window exploded inward. Wyatt Sterling didn't vault through the frame like a man. He launched himself through the splintered wood and glass like a wild beast protecting its mate. He collided with Silas's back just as the outlaw fired. The heavy-caliber bullet blew a hole through the ceiling timbers, missing Clara's head by inches. The sheer force of Wyatt's momentum carried both men out of the bedroom, crashing violently through the flimsy wooden back door of the kitchen and out into the muddy, snow-slushed yard behind the cabin. They hit the freezing ground in a tangle of limbs, curses, and raw fury. Silas was a big man, hardened by a lifetime of frontier violence, but he wasn't fighting a man tonight. He was fighting a force of nature. Wyatt roared, a primal, guttural sound that tore from his chest, and drove his heavy fist into Silas's jaw with the force of a striking anvil. Silas spit blood and bucked hard, using his knees to throw Wyatt off his chest. The outlaw scrambled in the mud, his hand desperately grabbing for the dropped revolver in the snow. Wyatt lunged, kicking the Colt away into the darkness. Silas snarled and reached into his boot, drawing a wicked 8-inch hunting knife. The firelight from the burning barn glinted off the serrated steel. He slashed wildly, the blade slicing through the heavy leather of Wyatt's duster. Wyatt didn't back down. He stepped inside the arc of the blade, grabbing Silas's wrist with both hands. The two massive men locked together in a deadly contest of strength, their boots slipping in the bloody, ash-covered snow. Silas forced the blade down, inches from Wyatt's throat, his teeth bared in a savage grimace. "I'm gonna gut you, Sterling," Silas hissed, saliva and blood flying from his lips. "And then I'm going back inside for your pretty little wife." The mention of Clara was the fatal mistake. A cold, terrifying calm settled over Wyatt's features. The grief that had haunted him for 5 years, the fear of losing his new family, the agonizing vulnerability of loving Clara, it all crystallized into a singular, unstoppable surge of adrenaline. Wyatt twisted his hips, using Silas's own downward momentum against him. He snapped Silas's wrist back with a sickening crack. The outlaw howled in agony, dropping the knife. Wyatt didn't stop. He drove a devastating right hook into Silas's ribs, followed by an uppercut that snapped the outlaw's head back with the sound of breaking bone. Silas crumpled to his knees in the mud, gasping for air, completely broken. Wyatt grabbed the collar of Silas's bearskin coat, hauling the half-conscious man up, his fist pulled back to deliver the final lethal blow. Silas had murdered Leo's parents. He had threatened Clara. Out here on the frontier, a man handled his own justice. "Wyatt, stop!" Clara's voice pierced through the red haze of his rage. She was standing on the shattered back porch, the shotgun lowered, her face pale but resolute in the firelight. "Don't kill him," Clara pleaded, her voice trembling but clear. "If you kill him in the mud like an animal, you're no better than he is. He needs to hang, in the light of day. Let the law do it." Wyatt hovered there, his fist trembling with the desperate urge to end the monster. He looked at Clara, seeing the woman who had brought light back into his dead world. She wasn't asking him to be weak. She was asking him to stay human. Slowly, his chest heaving with exertion, Wyatt released his grip. Silas collapsed face first into the muddy slush, groaning pitifully. Before Wyatt could catch his breath, the thunder of a dozen horses galloped into the front yard. Wyatt instinctively reached for his empty holster, turning to shield Clara. Caleb came running around the side of the cabin, his rifle lowered, a massive grin on his soot-stained face. "Boss, you're going to want to see this," Caleb shouted. Wyatt grabbed Silas by the scruff of his neck, dragging the defeated outlaw around to the front of the cabin. Clara followed closely behind. The yard was filled with heavily armed men mounted on sturdy cavalry horses. The fire from the barn illuminated the glint of silver stars pinned to their heavy winter coats. U.S. Marshals. Leading the posse was an older, hard-eyed marshal with a gray mustache. Tied to the saddle horn of the marshal's horse, looking bruised, disarmed, and thoroughly terrified, was Sheriff Miller. "Wyatt Sterling," the lead marshal called out, dismounting. "I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Vance Higgins out of Cheyenne. Looks like we missed the main event." "You're late, Marshal," Wyatt rasped, throwing Silas Thorne into the snow at the lawman's boots. "But you've got the right man. That's Silas Thorne." Marshal Higgins looked down at the bloody, groaning outlaw with deep satisfaction. "We picked up Sheriff Miller and 3 of Thorne's fleeing men on the ridge. Miller sang like a canary the second we put a rope around his neck." Higgins looked up, taking off his hat as he spotted Clara on the porch. "Mrs. Sterling, we rode as fast as the weather permitted. Your telegraph to the federal office in Cheyenne last week was highly detailed. We've been building a case against Thorne for months, but we didn't have the jurisdiction to bypass the local sheriff without probable cause." Wyatt turned and stared at Clara in shock. "You telegraphed the marshals? When?" Clara offered a small, apologetic shrug, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. "When we went into town to buy supplies, before Dirk Vance accosted us. I slipped into the telegraph office while you were loading the wagon. I knew Miller was corrupt, Wyatt. I wasn't going to let you fight an entire county alone." "You need evidence, Marshal," a small voice called out. From the shadows of the water trough, Leo emerged. He was covered in snow and mud, shivering violently, but his head was held high. He walked straight up to the towering federal marshal and reached inside his coat. He pulled out the black leather ledger and held it up. "My pa was Arthur Calloway," Leo said, his voice ringing with a fierce, heartbreaking pride. "He died keeping this safe. It proves everything. The bribes, the stolen deeds, the murders, everything." Marshal Higgins gently took the book from the boy's freezing hands, his hard eyes softening. "Your pa was a brave man, son. This book is going to put a lot of bad men at the end of a rope. You did good." The yard erupted into organized chaos as the marshals began securing the prisoners and helping Caleb organize a bucket line to ensure the barn fire didn't spread to the trees. The war was over. They had won. Wyatt turned back toward the porch. Clara was waiting for him at the top of the steps, tears of sheer relief finally spilling over her lashes. She rushed down the stairs, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his broad chest. "You're safe," she sobbed, holding him impossibly tight. "We're all safe." Wyatt wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her sweet-smelling hair. The crushing, suffocating weight of the past 5 years completely vanished, replaced by a profound, overwhelming love. "I've got you, Clara," Wyatt murmured against her temple. "I've got you." But as the adrenaline that had been fueling his body for the last hour suddenly evaporated, a violent, icy numbness rushed through Wyatt's veins. His knees buckled. "Wyatt!" Clara gasped as his massive weight sagged against her. She stepped back to support him, her hands slipping on the front of his duster. She looked down. In the flickering light of the dying fire, her hands were covered in fresh, dark crimson blood. Wyatt looked down at his own chest in vague surprise. High on his left shoulder, just below the collarbone, a dark, pulsing stain was spreading rapidly through his heavy flannel shirt. He had taken a bullet during the initial volley from the tree line, or perhaps when Silas's gun discharged in the bedroom. He had been fighting with a piece of lead in his shoulder the entire time, kept upright by pure, protective fury. Now, the fury was gone. Only the pain remained. The world tilted violently on its axis. The sound of the marshal's shouting faded into a dull underwater hum. "Wyatt! Oh, God, Wyatt, look at me!" Clara screamed, her medical training instantly warring with her absolute terror. She caught him as his legs gave out entirely, lowering him gently to the snowy planks of the porch. Wyatt looked up at her face. She was crying, her beautiful amber eyes wide with panic. He reached up with a heavy, trembling hand, his blood-stained fingers gently brushing a tear from her cheek. He managed a weak, tired smile, his eyelids fluttering shut. "I never regretted asking you," Wyatt whispered, his voice fading into the cold Wyoming wind as the darkness finally pulled him under. The kitchen table, where just hours ago they had shared a quiet morning coffee, was now slick with Wyatt's blood. Clara didn't panic. She couldn't afford to. The moment Wyatt's massive frame had collapsed on the porch, the town nurse had completely taken over the terrified bride. She barked orders at Caleb and Marshal Higgins, forcing them to carry Wyatt's unconscious body inside and lay him flat under the brightest oil lamps they had. "Boil water, now!" Clara commanded, stripping off her blood-soaked shawl and rolling up her sleeves. "And fetch my leather bag from the bedroom." Wyatt was pale, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Clara cut away the ruined, blood-stiffened fabric of his flannel shirt. The bullet had entered high on his left shoulder, dangerously close to the subclavian artery. It was a messy, jagged entry wound, but there was no exit wound. The lead was still inside him. For the next 2 hours, the cabin was transformed into a frontier surgery. Caleb stood steadfastly by Clara's side, holding the lantern steady with hands that had roped wild mustangs but now trembled slightly at the sight of his boss bleeding out. Clara's hands, however, were entirely steady. She used forceps and carbolic acid, her jaw set in a line of pure, uncompromising grit. Every time Wyatt groaned in his delirium, her heart cracked a little more, but she pushed the agonizing emotion down into a dark box and locked it. She couldn't be a wife right now. She had to be his savior. With a sickening metallic clink, Clara dropped the misshapen lead bullet into a tin basin. "I've got it," she exhaled, her voice shaking for the first time. "He's going to live." 3 days passed. The U.S. Marshals rode out, taking the bodies, the prisoners, and the ledger with them. The territory was finally safe. But inside the Sterling cabin, a suffocating, heavy silence had taken root. Wyatt's fever broke on the second night. By the third afternoon, he was sitting up in the armchair by the hearth, his left arm bound tightly in a sling. He stared into the fire, his face an unreadable mask of carved granite. Clara noticed the shift. The fierce, passionate man who had kissed her in the kitchen and defended her in town had vanished, replaced by the ghost of the reclusive widower she had known for 5 years. She walked into the main room carrying a cup of hot willow bark tea. As she handed it to him, Wyatt's blue eyes flicked up. They didn't land on her eyes, they landed on her cheek. During the scuffle in the bedroom, a piece of flying glass from the shattered window had grazed Clara's cheekbone, leaving a dark purple bruise and a thin red scab. Wyatt stared at the bruise. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked frantically beneath his skin. He looked past her toward the kitchen table where Leo was quietly drawing on a slate, and baby Lily was sleeping in her crate. He remembered the sheer, paralyzing terror in the boy's eyes. He remembered the cold steel of Silas Thorne's revolver pressed against Clara's head. "I almost lost them," the dark voice in Wyatt's head whispered. "Just like last time. You can't protect them. You only attract the wolves." "Drink this, Wyatt. It will help with the inflammation," Clara said softly, offering a tentative, hopeful smile. Wyatt didn't take the cup. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his good flannel shirt and pulled out a thick, folded envelope bearing the wax seal of his Cheyenne lawyer. The rider had delivered it that morning. He placed the envelope on the small table between them. "The adoption papers went through," Wyatt said. his voice completely devoid of emotion. It sounded like boots crunching on dead, frozen grass. The children are legally ours. Silas is going to hang and Miller is going to federal prison. Clara smiled, a wave of profound relief washing over her. That's wonderful, Wyatt. It's finally over. Yes, it is. Wyatt looked up at her, his eyes as bleak and desolate as a winter plain. Which means you don't need the shield anymore. Clara's smile faltered. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. What are you talking about? Wyatt nodded toward the envelope. My lawyer filed the adoption, but I had him draw up another document. It's an annulment. I've already signed it. It dissolves the marriage cleanly. The bank won't touch your clinic now that the threat of Miller is gone. I've also set up an account in Cheyenne in your name. It's enough money to take Leo and Lily back east. Boston, Philadelphia, wherever you want. Somewhere civilized. Somewhere safe. Clara stared at the heavy parchment envelope as if it were a rattlesnake coiled on the table. Her ears were ringing. An annulment? Wyatt, I don't understand. Why are you doing this? Wyatt stood up, towering over her, though he kept his physical distance. He couldn't let her see the agony tearing him apart inside. He had to be cruel to save her. Look at your face, Clara, he rasped, gesturing to her bruised cheek with his good hand. Look at my burned barn. Look at this bloody floor. This isn't a life for a woman like you, and it sure as hell isn't a life for those kids. I'm a violent man living in a violent world. I bring nothing but danger. That's not true, Clara cried, tears immediately springing to her eyes. You saved us! You saved those children! And I almost got you all killed, Wyatt roared, the sudden volume making Leo jump in his seat across the room. Wyatt instantly lowered his voice, his chest heaving. I watched my first wife die in this cabin, Clara. I'm not going to watch it happen again. The business arrangement is over. You're free. Take the money, take the kids, and get as far away from me as you can. Clara stood frozen. She looked into his eyes, searching for the man who had held her in the dark and told her she was his. But the walls were back up, built higher and thicker than steel. He didn't see a marriage. He just saw a duty he had fulfilled. Her pride, fierce and deeply wounded, flared to life, masking her shattering heart. I see, Clara whispered, her voice trembling but icy. She picked up the annulment papers. If that is what you truly want, Mr. Sterling, I'll have my bags packed by noon. By 1 o'clock, the wagon was loaded. Caleb stood by the draft horses, his face a mask of furious disapproval. He had argued with Wyatt in the barn for 20 minutes, but the boss was immovable. Caleb wouldn't disobey a direct order, but he made sure Wyatt knew exactly what he thought of him. Leo stood by the wagon wheel, holding Lily in her heavy blankets. The 8-year-old boy looked at Wyatt, who was standing on the porch, leaning heavily against the wooden post. Leo's gray eyes were full of a quiet, devastating betrayal. He didn't say a word. He just turned his back and climbed into the wagon bed. Clara walked out of the cabin for the last time. She wore her heavy wool cloak, her chin held high, refusing to let Wyatt see a single tear fall. She didn't look at him as Caleb helped her onto the bench. Wyatt stood on the porch, a stoic, unyielding statue. His face betrayed nothing. But inside, his soul was screaming. He was watching his entire world, his only chance at salvation, drive away into the cold Wyoming afternoon. He dug his fingernails into his palm until the skin broke, punishing himself. It's for the best, he repeated like a broken prayer. They're safe now. Caleb snapped the reins. Hyah! The heavy wagon lurched forward, its wheels cutting deep, bitter tracks into the melting snow, carrying Wyatt Sterling's heart away with it. The wagon was halfway down the long, winding drive toward the main gates of the Double S when the sky finally broke. It wasn't snow this time. It was a torrential, driving Wyoming rain. It fell in heavy gray sheets, washing the lingering black soot from the air and turning the snowbanks into a muddy, churning slurry. Clara sat rigid on the wooden bench. the icy rain soaking through her cloak. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the thick parchment of the annulment papers. "I'm a violent man living in a violent world." Wyatt's words echoed in her head over the drumming rain. Clara looked back over her shoulder. Leo was huddled under a canvas tarp, holding Lily, looking utterly miserable and adrift. They had survived a blizzard, an ambush, and a shootout, only to be cast out by the man who had sworn to protect them. And suddenly, Clara wasn't heartbroken anymore. She was furious. She realized exactly what Wyatt was doing. He wasn't rejecting her, he was terrified. That stubborn, foolish, broken cowboy was pushing her away because he loved her too much to risk losing her. He thought he was being noble, but all he was doing was letting the ghosts of his past dictate their future. Clara Hayes was a frontier woman. She had delivered babies in the middle of thunderstorms and set broken bones on the open trail. She did not run away from a fight. And she certainly didn't run away from the man she loved just because he was too damn scared to ask her to stay. "Caleb," Clara said, her voice slicing through the rain. "Stop the wagon." Caleb, looking thoroughly miserable in the downpour, didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He pulled back hard on the reins. "Whoa! Leo, stay under the tarp," Clara ordered. She pulled the annulment papers from her pocket and jumped down from the high bench, her boots sinking ankle-deep into the freezing mud. She didn't care about the mud. She didn't care about the rain pasting her honey-brown hair to her face. She marched back up the long driveway, her eyes locked on the cabin. Wyatt was exactly where she had left him. He was still standing on the porch, leaning against the timber post, letting the rain blow under the eaves and soak his clothes. He was watching the wagon, looking like a man standing before a firing squad. When he saw Clara marching back through the mud, his breath caught. He pushed himself off the post, his brow furrowing in confusion. Clara didn't slow down. She stomped up the 3 wooden steps onto the porch. Wyatt opened his mouth to speak, but he never got the chance. Smack! Clara's open palm struck his right cheek with a sharp, stinging crack that echoed over the rain. Wyatt flinched, his eyes widening in absolute shock. Before he could recover, Clara shoved the torn, crumpled annulment papers violently against his good shoulder, the parchment scattering like dead leaves onto the porch floorboards. "You arrogant, stubborn, cowardly fool!" Clara yelled, her amber eyes blazing with a magnificent, terrifying fire. "Clara, what are you—" "Shut up, Wyatt Sterling, and listen to me," she shouted, stepping right into his personal space, jabbing a hard finger into his chest. "You think you're being noble? You think you're protecting me by sending me away? You don't get to make that choice for me." Wyatt stared at her, entirely breathless, the sting on his cheek completely forgotten in the wake of her fury. "Family isn't a safe haven where nothing goes wrong, Wyatt," Clara cried, the rain and tears finally mixing on her face. "It's not a perfect glass box where nobody ever gets hurt. Family is the people who stand in the fire and shoot back with you. I didn't hold a shotgun in your kitchen because of a business arrangement. I did it because this is my home, those are my children, and you are my husband." Wyatt's fortress, the massive, impenetrable walls he had spent 5 years building, didn't just crack. They shattered into dust. He looked at this incredible, fierce woman standing before him in the freezing rain, fighting tooth and nail for him, when he hadn't even had the courage to fight for himself. "You belong to me, Wyatt," Clara said, her voice dropping to a fierce, ragged whisper. "And I belong to you. I am not running to the east. I am staying right here. So you are going to tear up those stupid papers, and you are going to kiss me, or I swear to God I will shoot you in your other shoulder." A wet, choked laugh broke free from Wyatt's chest. The darkness that had clouded his soul for half a decade evaporated under the blazing light of her love. "Yes, ma'am," Wyatt rasped. He didn't care about his injured shoulder. He reached out with his good arm, wrapping it tightly around her waist, and pulled her flush against his chest. He ducked his head, crashing his mouth down onto hers. It was a kiss of absolute surrender. Clara melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, kissing him back with all the desperate, overflowing love in her heart. The rain beat down on the tin roof of the porch, washing away the ashes of Silas Thorne, the blood in the snow, and the bitter loneliness of the past. Wyatt pulled back just an inch, resting his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily. "I love you," Wyatt whispered, the words feeling foreign but incredibly right on his tongue. "God, Clara, I love you so much it terrifies me." Clara smiled, a radiant, breathtaking expression that rivaled the sun. "I love you too, cowboy. Now go tell Caleb to turn that wagon around. Our children are getting cold." 1 year later. The Wyoming morning was painted in brilliant strokes of gold and azure. The brutal cold of winter was a distant memory, replaced by the warm, sweet-smelling breeze of late spring. On the Double S Ranch, the charred remains of the western barn were gone. In its place stood a massive, newly constructed timber barn, its fresh red paint gleaming in the sunlight. In the corral beside it, a chorus of healthy, lowing cattle signaled a prosperous year. 9-year-old Leo, wearing a dusty Stetson that was slightly too big for him and a pair of worn leather chaps, swung a lariat over his head. With a flick of his wrist, the loop sailed through the air, neatly catching a wooden calf dummy around the neck. "Got him!" Leo cheered, pulling the rope taut. "Good throw, son!" Wyatt Sterling sat in a large, comfortable rocking chair on the expanded front porch. He looked healthy, ruggedly handsome, and entirely at peace. His left shoulder bore a silver scar, but it didn't bother him much anymore. What occupied his arms currently was far more important. 14-month-old Lily, a mess of dark curls and bright, inquisitive eyes, was standing on Wyatt's thighs, her tiny hands gripping his flannel shirt as she babbled excitedly at her brother's roping skills. "You see that, Lilybug?" Wyatt chuckled, his deep voice vibrating with pure warmth. "Your brother's going to be the best roper in the territory." The heavy oak screen door creaked open. Clara stepped out onto the porch, carrying a tray with 3 tall glasses of iced lemonade. She looked radiant. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, her cheeks possessed a healthy, permanent flush, and the fabric of her gingham dress stretched comfortably over the undeniable, beautiful swell of her 6-month pregnant belly. Wyatt's eyes immediately tracked to her, his gaze softening into absolute adoration. Even after a year of marriage, looking at her still made his heart skip a beat. "Lemonade for my hard-working cowboys," Clara announced, setting the tray on the small porch table. Leo dropped his rope and came running up the steps, his boots thudding happily on the wood. "Thanks, Ma," he grinned, grabbing a glass and taking a long gulp. Clara smiled, ruffling the boy's dusty hair. She walked over to Wyatt's chair, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss to his lips. Wyatt freed one arm from holding Lily to wrap it around Clara's waist, his large hand coming to rest gently, reverently over her pregnant stomach. "How are my 2 girls doing this morning?" Wyatt murmured against her lips. Clara rested her hand over his, her amber eyes shining with a deep, abiding contentment. "Kicking like a wild Mustang," she laughed softly, "just like her father." Wyatt smiled, looking out over the sprawling, sunlit expanse of the Sterling Ranch. He watched Leo run back to his rope, heard Lily's sweet, infectious giggle, and felt the heartbeat of his unborn child beneath his palm. A year ago, he had been a ghost, haunting a frozen wasteland waiting to die. Today, he was the richest man in Wyoming. He had stood in the freezing night and made a choice to shield a broken family, never realizing that the family would be the ones to shield him. He pulled Clara a little closer, the Wyoming breeze carrying the scent of pine and sweetgrass, knowing with absolute certainty that he was finally, truly home.